Ben, welcome back. It's so great to hear you again.
Hey, Steve, thanks for having me. Good to be here.
So I want to start with the financial numbers that were put out. You took a long, hard look at it. Penn State brought in more money than ever, but it's also spent more in the athletic department. What was your general feel as to what you saw in the numbers?
Yeah, I mean, I think it reflects the notion these days that if you want to win, you're going to have to spend more. I think the idea that, that winning is cheap, especially with inflation, that's not the case. And I think Penn State, you look across the board, I thought it was interesting. We talk a lot about the football numbers, the basketball numbers, some of those sports that are maybe top of mind for a lot more people. But you look at the money that Penn State spent on all of its other athletic areas, all of its different teams. It spent more money in that fiscal year across the board on each and every program. And I think, some years that's been the case for some programs, some years it hasn't been the case. But across the board, every program saw more money, and every program, except for one, I believe, brought in more money. So, when you tell people that Penn State spent more money, I think the natural question is to say, well, where's the biggest area? And the answer is pretty much everywhere. I mean, some of the main numbers, you can look at Penn State football's recruiting budget effectively, not technically, but basically doubled in that year and continues to go up. We should assume to see the same thing the next time that report comes out in terms of its growth. So it's really across the board. Penn State's obviously always in the business of hiring more administrators and more people to sort of run the ship, if you will. So it's not just one thing; it's everything. And I think that's sort of the direction that the intercollegiate athletics, for better or for worse, is headed.
It also should be pointed out that this is the last report that they'll put out under the old TV contract. The next report will include the new numbers from the current TV contract, which is backloaded, by the way, but it's going to include those numbers. How interested are you to see the escalation there on the media side of it that can make a difference?
Yeah, I mean, it's a huge difference. I think if you're Pat Kraft, that's one of the great advantages that you have right now, that there's no question that he has probably the most aggressive infrastructure agenda that, a Penn State administrator or athletic director has really had. But at the same time, he's also working with more money than anybody before him has ever had. I think the fact that media rights deal kicks in, it's a lot of money that you go, okay, how do we want to use this? What's the best way to use it? Because you look at last year's report, the previously released one. Penn State had about $10 million extra dollars in the budget. It's not really a profit building, circumstance. They're not putting that away to just sort of sit on it for forever. This year it was a little over $100,000. But you add in all of that media rights money. It's a lot of things to work with, and you figure they're going to use it because you and I both know, certainly the process of financing Beaver Stadium's renovation, is going to come from a lot of different areas, but it ain't cheap, and everywhere that money can come in that they can send towards that and all their other departments and all their other teams is more money to work with, and that's good news for Penn State as it tries to tackle this agenda.
In fact, it's not just the Fox, CBS, NBC money that will now be a part of the mix. They also have the new contract with Playfly that will kick in beginning on June 1st as well. So that's what I'm thinking. I'm interested in what the total picture looks like. And maybe some of the spending that was done this year was in anticipation that they knew they could back it up with revenue coming up.
Yeah, there's no question. I look forward to hearing how many times it takes you before you get Playfly coming out of your mouth the right way, other than Learfield. But I don't know what kind of NDAs you have to sign at this point to make sure that doesn't happen. But in any case, I think there's no question that you've got to be strategic about how you spend their money. I think that's one of the interesting things when you look at these reports is there's a lot of information, but there's also sometimes there's not a ton of context, or you have to kind of dig into it to figure out what happened and why. But yeah, there's no question that some preemptive spending this year could be in part because things are coming down the pipes that aren't reflected into that report. There's no question that's definitely part of it. One of the example is Penn State it reports its giving, but only when it's used in terms of money that comes in through philanthropy. So there's always stuff in the works that we just don't know about until it hits the books, and when it hits the books is very often much different than when the pledge was made.
So there's not going to be a drinking game if I say Learfield, is there? I just want
somebody somewhere will be drinking. I think there's no question about that. But as to why, I'll leave that up to them.
Yes, exactly right. We'll find out. One of them I usually look at is the wrestling numbers. And the only reason I look at the wrestling numbers is because of the great respect all of us have for the program, and they sell out all the time. And I think to me, it's always the message to me is how difficult it is for an Olympic sport to make money if that one can't. I mean, because it's the platinum standard of sports. Did you take a good close at that one? Look, yeah, I know you look at all of them, but how close do you look at that one?
Yeah, I mean, I think you're right that it's a good example because I think a lot of people, when they talk about these numbers, and to answer a more immediate question, Penn State Wrestling made, I think it comes as no surprise, a lot of money last year in terms of the revenue that they brought in. But like you said, I think it's really a great example of how hard it is really for any athletic department across the country for these Olympic sports to be a cash positive endeavor. That, it costs a lot to turn on the money at Rec Hall. It costs a lot of money to run the show. It costs a lot of money to travel. And, obviously wrestling uniforms aren't exactly the most robust, but you've got to pay for equipment and things like that. And it has historically not been a cash positive venture. As you and I both know, it's pretty much just football and men's basketball. And that really just has to do with the fact that, football is obviously its own thing. Men's basketball gets a lot of help from its part of the media rights deal as well. And hockey has technically been a cash positive thing, but a lot of that has to do with the fact that they put the money for running Pagula in a different bucket in the budgetary things, but for all intents and purposes, it's not necessarily cash positive either. But yeah, wrestling is a great example. Sell out every duel, sell out every Jordan Center thing, sell out, everything they've got to sell. People will buy it. People will show up. It's great. And yet it's still a challenge to be cash positive. And I think that's part of the reason why Penn State football and its success is obviously so important and why so many athletic departments across the country, it's not that they don't care about these other sports. It's just that there's really only one or two that are really paying for everything. And that usually comes down to football and basketball.
And again, based on their numbers, I mean, it was a minus 800,000 this year. And over 2 years, in over 2 years, it's almost 2 million. And a lot of people find it hard to fathom that the platinum standard program that you can't find a ticket for is in that spot. But that tells you how important the media rights happen to be. It tells you how important the college football playoff distribution, how important that is. It tells you how important the NCAA men's basketball distribution happens to be. I mean, to me, that's what it outlines all, because the NCAA distribution, it's on the line there. It's right there as a line. For wrestling, it's $49,000.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's an intricate puzzle. I don't think that I have the brain power to try and unpack tournament units and things like that they hand out after the tournament to different conferences for the success that they have. But yeah, I mean, it's a difficult endeavor, and that's part of the reason why you've seen athletic departments across the country have to figure out how they're going to make it all work. And one of the reasons why Penn State's been so fortunate to be an athletic department that not only has as many programs as it does, but able to keep them. I think that's one of the things that's a different conversation altogether. But you look at some of the places like Alabama, Clemson, so those are two that come to mind off the top of my head, that they have significantly fewer athletic programs in total compared to Penn State. And when it comes to football, when it comes to facilities, when it comes to all of those things, that money's got to go somewhere, and that's been, feeding a lot of these programs and making sure that they stay afloat. And that's always been a point of pride for Penn State, probably something that always should be. But yeah, it's an intricate model. And, I remember telling Pat Chambers once when we were one of the first times they shot fireworks off at Beaver Stadium that went his entire recruiting budget. So it's a challenge out there to make it all work. And Penn State, to its credit, especially coming out of COVID-19, where that was hard for everybody, has figured a way to stand on both 2 feet.
All right, shifting gears, because it's great to have the opportunity to talk to you about such things. Penn State on football has had to replace all 3 coordinators along the way, with Stacy Collins ending up going to Boise State. Now Justin Lustig comes in to go with Andy Koltonicki, to go with Tom Allen. What's been your thought on the coordinators that were brought in, and what does it mean to a program when that happens?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's no question that, Penn State was afforded a lot of consistency and continuity over the years, and that's just not how, the world works anymore. I think if you're James Franklin, you go, did I get better? And, obviously, defensively, it's hard to imagine that Penn State defense could be better. And that was not really the charge there. I think that to replace, Manny Diaz is just a matter of finding someone who can grab a hold of those things and keep it in place. I think Tom Allen is a sensible hire for that. I think Andy Koltanicki has done a great job his entire career of, making the most of what he's got. And I think that was really, it's a different conversation, but I think one of Penn State's weaknesses this year was really in those big games going, so what exactly are we good at and how do we make the most of that? And I think that that's really the charge now, is to do that and to answer that question. And I think, frankly, I think Stacey Collins is a nice guy. He did a really good job this year from, the special teams unit started out a little shaky and became, for the most part, really something that Penn State could lean on throughout the rest of the year. But I don't think a special teams is a sort of hire where you can really read the headline and go, wow, I'm impressed. And I actually think that Penn State made a hire that you go, you read this guy's resume, you see what he has done, you see the fact that, he's had that consistency throughout his career. You go, this is actually a good special teams hire. And I don't know how many times, and it's all due respect to special teams because no one cares about it until they do, that I think that, it says a lot about their ability to identify people that are going to fill their needs and do that. And, special teams is important. And if you can hire somebody in all three phases of the game that makes you feel like you got better or at least stayed the same, I think that there's no question that change is not ideal for any program, but I think that's the end result you're looking for.
How did you view the transfer portal pickups by Penn State? And I know this is a wide-ranging question, but also the fact that Devon Ellies, Akeem Beeman, Sal Wormley, Nick Dawkins, Keandre Lambert-Smith also opted to come back. How do you view that total package there?
Yeah, I mean, I think at the end of the day that Penn State has staked its claim in the idea that the best way to do this is to keep guys, to develop them, to recruit them, and then go into the portal and find guys that might answer your needs. And I think that the portal for Penn State has really sort of bear the truth that picking a guy up doesn't mean he's going to solve your problems. I think we saw Mitchell Tinsley, receiver, came right in, made a big impact on Penn State. Penn State would have loved to have had him this year. And then you look at Dante Cephas, who, for whatever reason, for a lot of different reasons, it didn't pan out the same way. And I think they were both pretty similar guys in the portal in terms of people wanting them, in terms of where they came from, in terms of what we thought they were going to be able to do. And you got two very different sorts of results. So I think that you look again, Julian Fleming, there's no question that's a guy that, Penn State has wanted for forever. It seems like, I think I made the joke that the recruiting department probably went into an old PDF file somewhere of Julian Fleming commitment things and then edited him to make him look older. That's a good pickup. But I think what you need to learn from the portal is you don't know what you've got until they're playing games that matter. And I think for Penn State, when it comes to keeping guys that are known commodities, you know what you're going to get out of Hakeem Beeman. You know what you're going to get out of Devon Ellies. And I think that we know Keandre Lambert-Smith can be a better player than he was at times this year. So to me, Lane Kiffin said it at one of the Peach Bowl press conferences that Penn State's one of the best programs at keeping guys out of the portal and really not having to shop there. And Ole Miss and Penn State have really been sort of opposite ends of that coin in terms of transfer portal acquisition. So to me, it's a good balance. And I think at the end of the day, the more guys that you can keep into your program for longer, the better off you're going to be. And Penn State was able to do that and then address some needs in the portal, and we'll just have to wait and see how they fit.
Yeah, in fact, Lane Kiffin was literally on the Alabama campus. You're allowed to do it. It's within the rules, but they have so many players in the portal. He was actually on campus wanting to talk with people. That aside, we'll get to that story in a little bit. Love talking basketball with you as well. You know your hoops as well as anybody. Penn State beat Wisconsin 87-83 on Tuesday night. Wisconsin came into the game ranked 11th. We all know it's been a roller coaster for this team to this point. What did you see that was a little different on Tuesday night?
Well, they made shots. I think that's, the great joy about basketball is, football can be this complex sport where you need a lot of things to go well, and sometimes it's just, you don't have the physical aptitude to blow somebody off the line. Basketball, anybody can throw that thing up, and it's going to go in regardless of a lot of different factors. And I think Penn State finished well at the rim. I think it shot well. It shot its free throws well. I think that it got back to really what has been Penn State basketball's MO through all of these head coaches as of late is really, maybe we're not more skilled than you, and that hasn't always been the case. Certainly recently, Penn State's been the better team, but independent of that, we're going to outwork you. And I think that we saw a Penn State team that, to their credit, through the ups and downs, through the frustrations and whatnot, came out and said, look, maybe we're not the better shooting team, and they turned out to be the better shooting team, but we're going to at least win more of these 50-50 balls. We're going to find ways to create turnovers. Ace Baldwin is, it changes every night, but at least in the top 10 in terms of steals per game. These guys are out there working hard, and there's been more than a few head coaches that have said the word attitude around that program, but I think attitude is certainly a good way to address or to sort of sum up what Penn State did well that night.
Let me ask you something. In your coverage of sports these days, football, basketball, what kind of role does analytics play in how you view sports today, if at all?
I think it's informative in a lot of ways because I think that the challenge is that I think sports makes you feel a lot of things in terms of, I feel like this team is not good at X, Y, or Z. And I think analytics gives you the ability to say, is that true? And go and sort of dive into the nitty-gritty of does what I feel match the data. Now, I think that, every coach and every player will tell you that, you can have paralysis by analysis. You can, there's tempo stats and all sorts of things that tell you X, Y, or Z about a team, and you don't really know what to do with that. But I think that it's a great tool at large to have to inform you of how do I feel, and does that match the data? And for me, from the perspective of trying to tell people what I think happened and why it happened, I think it's really invaluable. But certainly, I understand coaches and players that want to have not a safe distance, because I think it's a good tool, but a balance between, I think James Franklin has said that, what the numbers tell you and what your feel is in the moment of the game.
Ben, always a pleasure. Thanks so much for taking the time today. It's great to have you back on.
Yep, thanks for having me, Steve.
What did you think when you heard that Bill got the Ohio State job, and what do you think that means of Ryan Day's mindset?
Well, I think I talked to Ryan last week at the coaches convention in Nashville, and he realizes that it's time to back away from the play calling and the offensive operation and be more of a CEO as he enters what we all agree is a pivotal season. So he wanted to find somebody who certainly he'd be comfortable with, but also he did mention NFL to me as where he may look for a coordinator. So it makes sense. Bill O'Brien, who spent most of his career in the NFL, but obviously had obviously time at Penn State, but also other college stops early on, kind of fits the mold of what Ryan Day wanted. I think what's going to be very interesting is just how they work together and where Bill O'Brien can take the offense that maybe they weren't getting there with Ryan Day and Brian Hartline and some of the personnel. I mean, this is a very, very talented offense that's returning, but one that has some question marks. Most notably, is Will Howard the answer at quarterback? Right. They have a running back tandem that I think is going to be the best in college football going into the season, with Travion Henderson and then Quinshon Judkins coming in from Ole Miss. Mecca Ibuka is back at receiver.
Yep.
But it's a group that ultimately couldn't score enough in the most important game of the season, and was really decimated in their bowl game. So definitely some growth needed for the Buckeye offensive line.
You talked about the coaches convention. Adam, what were your takeaways from the coaches convention that you feel, after listening to certain people, can move the game forward?
Well, yeah, that's the thing, though. Are they going to be listened to? I mean,
right.
The coaches have their opinions. Oftentimes they come off as complaining, but one thing that was consistent to me in talking to them last week is that they believe they forecasted a lot of the challenges in college football. I don't say problems because that's their word, and I'm not saying that they're all problems, but I think the coaches believe they saw a lot of what's happening now coming, and by not being listened to, and maybe their ideas didn't go far enough, there have been some real challenges around the sport, especially regarding the portal and NIL. So, they all have ideas as far as the calendar and how it needs to change. I think one thing that they came out with is that they want the signing date, the early signing date, to be before the opening of the transfer portal. Right now it's not, and there's some real consequences to having that sequence the way it is. I think they think a 30-day total window for the portal is better than a 45-day window, but there's all sorts of ideas, Steve. I mean, a prominent Power 5 coach said his plan would be to get rid of the early signing date, but essentially make it that Wednesday, February, whatever it is, signing date would be open for a calendar year, beginning with the high school juniors. So those who have completed their junior year could begin signing for a full calendar year until the February of their senior year. So that was a different idea I heard. And they're all over the place in terms of ideas, but there's certainly a desire to make changes to the way it is right now because it has been so hectic.
Hypothetically, if they move the early signing period before the transfer portal open, could that lead to more firings in season?
For sure. Although this year we did not see that a whole lot. Last year we saw a lot of early firings. Now I think part of that was circumstantial, and you had a number of coaches who were entering their seasons with very little chance to keep their job. Like a Clay Helton a couple of years ago, or last year. You looked at Scott Frost and Jeff Collins at Georgia Tech, and Herm Edwards at Arizona State, Brian Harsin at Auburn. Those were all seen as jobs that were almost for sure going to open. I think we could see that this year, potentially. You look at Billy Napier at Florida, Dave Aranda at Baylor, Sam Pittman at Arkansas. If they don't get off to good starts, I think you could see changes made relatively early to try to get ahead of that next portal cycle. So I think part of it's the way it is now because of the calendar, but part of it's also the individual circumstances.
Charlie Baker made some interesting proposals before all of this happened, some of it dealing with NIL, others with the portal. Were any of those ideas discussed at the coaches' convention? And if so, what was the reception to at least the thought process?
Yeah, I think they were discussed. I think there's still some frustration with the NCAA in terms of speed in acting to create change. But I think there's an excitement that at least the head of the NCAA is thinking about this in a realistic way. That not all schools are the same, and that some type of controls around NIL can be beneficial. So I think that there's a desire to really push some of these things through as quickly as possible, but and also just recognizing the realities that some programs are just going to be better equipped than others in the NIL environment but they all want some level of control. I mean, coaches, as you know, want control, and they don't feel like there's any control right now over especially NIL. They have been relatively pleased with the transfer windows, but like I said, they want those to be even tighter than they are right now.
Okay, so we are also entering the new era, the 12-team playoff, and a new era of 18 teams in the Big Ten. Don't teach your children through college football. There are 18 in the Big Ten. And 16 in the SEC. How interested are you in how this is going to work out? And is there an excitement level to it or an interest level to it for you?
Oh, I think there's excitement. Again, I don't love an 18-team Big Ten,
right?
Because I think you lose some of the things that make conferences unique. But we're past that point, right? I mean, conferences are not what they were when we were growing up or when we entered the sport. And that just is what it is. You can wring your hands about it. You can pine for the old days, but this is not where we are right now. I am very excited for the 12-team playoff. And I've advocated for a bigger playoff for a number of years, and I've done so in a sense of it's not to create more possible national champions. It would be great if a team that squeaks in as the 11th seed or the 10th seed wins 4 games in a row to win a national championship. The odds of that happening are not great. But the fact that those teams are going to be part of the CFP, and you're going to have games on campus, and you're going to have more inclusivity, and it's going to be a truly national playoff, those are all good things for the sport. That's how it exists in virtually every other sport, but college football. And so that part of it is going to be really exciting. And I think it creates all sorts of interesting conversations, like, what if Ryan Day loses to Michigan again but makes the college football playoff and wins a national title? How do you feel about him at that point, or reaches the national title game? How much more is that a barometer for Penn State that, would have been in the college football playoff if it had been larger over the last 10 years or so, but hasn't made it yet at 4 teams? When is that the standard for James Franklin and Penn State in most seasons? I think there's a few programs that really should realistically expect to make the playoff every year, but there's a much larger group of programs that should anticipate at least having a chance to make the playoff every once in a while, or 2 out of every 5 years, or whatever you want to call a metric. So that part is really exciting to me.
I mean, you can argue that year one, when Ohio State as a 4 beat Alabama as a 1, is the biggest upset in the 4-team playoff era. You can make that argument. One thing about, for example, USC's coming in Andy Enfield, but he coached at Florida Gulf Coast, and they beat Georgetown and San Diego State, got to the Sweet 16. Did they win the national title? No. How important do you think for the excitement level is that somewhere along the line, Air Force, for example, goes out and they beat a USC in round 1 for whatever reason? What would that mean to college football, just to even have that? Not Air Force winning it all, because they're not going to, but to even do something like that.
Yeah, I mean, again, I think it's going to be really interesting to see how valuable home field is in that first round.
Yeah.
Or even how valuable not playing in your conference championship game could be in that first round, because you'd have extra time to rest and prepare for the game. So of those 4 first-round games, are those 4 home wins, or are those 3 home wins? Are we going to see some upsets? I mean, that's certainly exciting. But, I think it's very unrealistic to expect anyone who's in that first round to run the table and win a national title. Not saying it can't happen, but it's a very difficult task to win, 4 postseason games in football in a relatively, you're talking about a month span. The first round of the playoff,
right,
I believe this next year is December 20th.
Yes.
And then the national championship game is January 20th. So you're talking about 4 games in a month span at the very highest level, traveling around the country. That's asking a lot. So my anticipation is that most of the national champions, and that's, again, what makes it exciting and why you want to be a top 4 seed, because your chances of winning a national championship go way up.
Which brings us to the next part, and that is what happens with Florida State. These days, to be a writer or to come on shows like these, you have to somehow talk to somebody who has a legal background. So what is the grasp that you have to this point on Florida State versus the ACC?
Right. Well, again, not surprised that Florida State was the first, ACC team that challenged the grant of rights openly and has made it very clear that it wants to explore its options outside of the league. I still think most of the legal interpretations are on the ACC side, namely that Florida State agreed to this grant of rights. Its representatives signed it back in 2016, and the ACC has that information. So it'll be fascinating to see, obviously, where the legal cases go, and how different judges interpret some of Florida State's arguments. I just don't think that it's realistic to expect Florida State to be in the ACC for 10 more years, right, or I guess we're looking at 12 more. You know how these things go. I mean, if you want to get divorced, you're really going to stay in a separation or an unhappy situation for, 4, 8, 12 years. I just don't think that's going to happen. You saw it even with the Texas and Oklahoma moving out of the Big 12 earlier. I think you can typically get to a point where, again, an expensive point, but a point where the two sides can kind of go their separate ways.
Right, and exactly. And Florida State not only signed it once, they signed it twice. I mean, that's what's interesting about this, because they signed that thing 2 different times along the way. When you look at the landscape of college football now, for the moment, TV contracts are settled except for the college football playoff contract. Outside of Florida State, is there the possibility of stabilization for at least a couple of years?
Well, I think it's possible because the Big 12 is now set with who's going to be in that league. There obviously is a possibility that they look to add more from what's left of the Pac-12. That would obviously be Oregon State and Washington State, but I don't think any existing Big 10 or SEC teams are going anywhere. So all eyes again are on the ACC and to see where this thing goes, because you're naive if you don't think Clemson is going to do the same thing as Florida State, and maybe North Carolina and Miami and Virginia and some of those other reported teams that are at least exploring this would follow suit. This is a copycat enterprise, a copycat landscape, and so that's where the attention is. But I don't sense that there's going to be other movement other than if we can get to a point where there's this football breakaway and a super league, and these are the teams that are part of that, and it'll be fascinating to see where that cutoff is, and if every existing Big Ten and SEC team is essentially grandfathered into that league, or if there are cutoffs within those conferences, and if there are other teams that are outside of those two leagues that would be part of it. Obviously Clemson, Florida State, those types of programs would have to be part of a super league, but who else makes it and who doesn't would be very interesting.
Tim Murphy retired. You did a nice article about him. What does a guy like that mean to the game after 30 years at Harvard?
It's kind of amazing. 30 years at one program, and just reading about how Harvard had really not had much success for the previous 50, 60 years before he arrived, then started winning Ivy League titles and 10 Ivy League titles, tied for the most in history of that league, and certainly the number of 8+ win seasons, the record against Yale. Certainly, you talk about Nick Saban being the greatest coach in college football history. I think you could look at Tim Murphy, at least in modern Harvard history, given their realities, where they belong in the current college football landscape, is sort of being their greatest coach.
Always a pleasure, Adam. Thanks so much for being with us. Really appreciate it.
All right, great. Thanks for having me.
You bet. Adam Rittenberg, ESPN.